In 1945, Germany lay in ruins. The heart had been torn out of her cities. This was the result of a secret revolution in the technology of air warfare. In 1939, when war broke out, most of Britain's bombers lacked the range, bomb capacity, and navigational aids to inflict significant damage on Germany. Bomber Command was a paper tiger. Ironically, the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, had been the first to harness new technologies. In the Blitz of 1940, its Pathfinder bombers had ridden electronic beams to illuminate targets in Britain's industrial cities. The British, and later their American allies, fought back as the battle was transferred to the skies over Germany. It was a seesaw battle in which both sides strove to establish the slender strategic edge which meant the difference between defeat and victory. Above all, it was a war of the so-called black boxes. It was one of the most costly and critical technological battles of the war. In 1932, the British politician Stanley Baldwin had gloomily predicted that the bomber will always get through. This sentiment was shared by Adolf Hitler, who in 1935 revealed Germany's massive rearmament program. The Luftwaffe's bombers were a grim reminder to the rest of Europe of Germany's intent. But under the direction of Hermann Goering, the Luftwaffe's bombers were developed to fulfill a tactical rather than a strategic role. Dive bombers, like the Ju-87 Stuka, were designed to act as airborne artillery in the short-range campaigns against his neighbors, which Hitler was already contemplating. The Ju-88 bomber also incorporated a dive bombing capability. German air chiefs ruled out the building of a fleet of heavy strategic bombers. It was too costly and would take too long. Nevertheless, an early version of Germany's standard medium bomber, the Heinkel He-111, demonstrated its destructive power in the Spanish Civil War. He-111s and Junkers Ju-52s of the German Condor Legion, flying for Franco's nationalists, destroyed the Republican town of Guernica in 3 hours of incendiary bombing. Guernica added grim weight to Baldwin's fatalistic prediction. The bomber had got through. The British prepared for a wider war with air raid precautions, ARP for short. During the Munich crisis of 1938, makeshift air raid shelters were dug in London's public parks. Gas masks were issued to men, women, and children. In the mid-1930s, Britain had been ill-prepared to combat a concerted air offensive. Sound locators provided primitive early warning of approaching bomber formations. Ironically, London was the last target Hitler's Air Force had in mind. But in the late 1930s, the British government anticipated tens of thousands of casualties on the first day of war. It stockpiled millions of cardboard coffins to meet the looming crisis. The keenest disciple of strategic bombing remained the Royal Air Force. Its official doctrine insisted that a war with Germany could be won with the precision bombing of industrial targets. But as war drew nearer, it was clear that the RAF's Bomber Command lacked the tools for the job. Its night bombing force consisted of obsolescent Whitleys whose crews preferred to train by day. Day bombing lay in the hands of self-defending formations of Blenheims, Hampdens and Wellingtons. With the advent of German fighters like the Me-109, the day bombers were highly vulnerable. The chief of RAF Bomber Command, Air Chief Marshal Sir Edgar Ludlow Hewitt, agonized over the frailties of his bomber force. Early in 1939, he informed the Air Ministry that in all-out war, his Blenheims would be lost in less than a month. Within another 3 months, his Wellingtons, Whitleys and Hampdens would go the same way. When war broke out in September 1939, the British government, fearful of German retaliation, suspended bomber operations which might cause civilian deaths. For the moment, the bomber had been quietly put back on the shelf. From September 1939 to the winter of 1940, the initiative lay with Germany. Poland, invaded on the 1st of September, lasted barely 5 weeks. Its obsolescent air force was no match for the Luftwaffe. Stuka dive bombers operated at the forward point of contact with the enemy. The destruction of pinpoint targets was the Stuka's speciality. The terror bombing of the Polish capital, Warsaw, was left to the HE-111s. Once more, the bombers had got through. The Dutch city of Rotterdam was the next to suffer at the hands of the HE-111s in May 1940, as Hitler launched his blitzkrieg in the west. Dutch resistance was shattered by a heavy air raid on the center of Rotterdam. More cities were threatened. The Dutch surrendered. Free of the obstinate Dutch resistance on their right flank, German armored divisions now rolled up the slow-moving French and their British allies. By June 1940, Germany occupied a dominant position in northwest and central Europe. France capitulated, and the British Expeditionary Force had been driven back across the Channel. It had left all of its transport and heavy equipment in France. The evacuation from Dunkirk had been an heroic feat, but wars are not won by evacuations. Now all that stood between Hitler and the invasion of Britain were the pilots of RAF Fighter Command. They held the thin blue line. On the other side of the Channel, the German army was readying a fleet of invasion barges. But before they could sail, Fighter Command had to be eliminated. Hermann Goering and his Luftwaffe were intoxicated with the victories won in Poland and France. Now the Royal Air Force would be swept aside. But the Luftwaffe was now committed to fighting a strategic campaign at a longer range than that for which it had been designed. Its bombers would need heavy fighter escort. In the Battle of Britain, the RAF Spitfires and Hurricanes would be fighting over their own bases. The German Me-109s could remain over England for a maximum of 30 minutes. And the British air defences possessed a vital weapon, the chain-home radar system, which could pick up incoming German formations before they crossed the coast of France. The RAF's fighters did not have to fly wasteful standing patrols, but could be scrambled to meet an identified threat and then vectored onto their targets. The integration of radar into the RAF's command and control system was a story which, in truly British style, combined the brilliant application of science with a native eccentricity. The Germans too were developing radar, but had concentrated on its offensive rather than defensive applications. The British might appear whimsical, but their system worked. Radar was one of the keys to the narrow margin that Fighter Command was to enjoy over the Luftwaffe in the Battle of Britain. Without it, the battle would have been lost. German bombers would take off from their bases in northern France, get into formation, and then fly towards the English Channel. It was now that the chain home radars picked them up. The information was passed to Fighter Command headquarters and also the headquarters of the fighter group defending the area. Fighter Command then ordered the group to attack. In the meantime, coastal AA guns had been engaging the bombers as they came within range. But so as not to shoot down friendly aircraft, the guns ceased firing on the orders of group headquarters before the fighters were airborne. The orders were now sent to the relevant airfields for the fighters to scramble. They took off and were guided to the bombers by their sector control room. The Luftwaffe fatally underestimated the importance of the chain home system. On only one occasion, on the 12th of August 1940, did it launch a concerted attack on 4 key chain home stations on the south coast. Dive bombing raids forced one station off the air for 24 hours, but the other 3 continued transmitting. The Germans could detect no appreciable gap in the network and mounted no more attacks. They had let their chance slip. As the German fighter commander Adolf Galland observed, "In the battle we had to rely on our own human eyes. The British fighter pilots could depend on the radar eye, which was far more reliable and had a longer range." In September, the Luftwaffe turned its attention to the bombing of London and Britain's major ports and industrial cities. Bombing by day quickly gave way to a night offensive, which was to last 8 months until May 1941. Now it was the Luftwaffe's turn to take the initiative in the secret electronic war. In June 1940, Winston Churchill's scientific advisor, Professor Lindemann, had warned the British Prime Minister that the Germans had developed a system of radio beams as a blind bombing device. British scientific intelligence knew that the system was codenamed Knickerbein, or Crooked Leg. Now they had to unravel its secrets. German bomber pilots flying along a radio beam received a steady note. If they strayed off course, they heard either Morse dots or dashes. A second beam intersecting the first told pilots when to release their bombs. British scientific intelligence was quickly on to Knickerbein, and RAF Avro Anson was able to pick up and ride along one of the primary beams laid across the Midlands. It intersected with the bombing beam over the Rolls-Royce factory at Derby. Having detected the beams, the British set about jamming them. By October 1940, when the Luftwaffe began using them in earnest, the jamming was powerful enough to make Knickerbein all but useless. A second, more sophisticated system was waiting in the wings, used exclusively by an elite pathfinding formation, KGR-100. The X-Verfahren system employed 2 stations. The first, codenamed Weser, transmitted the beam ridden by the bomber. The bomber flew the beam, which was intersected by 3 beams transmitted by the second station. The first warned the pilot that he was nearing the target. At the second intersection, the pilot set a bombing clock. Hitting the third beam, the pilot activated a second hand on the clock, which ensured automatic release of the bombs over the target. In the early stages of what became known as the Blitz, Britain's air defences were almost wholly ineffectual. Anti-aircraft guns reassured people on the ground, but were no threat to the bombers above. Some night fighters carried ground-controlled airborne interception radars, but these were primitive. More sophisticated were the British codebreakers at Bletchley Park. They were beginning to unravel the secrets of the German Armed Services Enigma encoding machine. Enigma messages, broadcast in Morse, were being intercepted by listeners at the top-secret Y service and decoded at Bletchley Park. Combined with the interrogation of captured aircrew, this enabled British intelligence to build up a picture of how the X system worked and its connection with KGR-100. But the German bombers still had a good run for their money. The X-beams were used on the night of the 14th of November 1940, when KGR-100 paved the way for over 400 bombers attacking the city of Coventry, a centre of British war production. The heart of the city was devastated. Its famous cathedral was reduced to ruins. But the days of the X-beams were also numbered. The British had captured an X-system set and were now interfering with the beams laid over Britain. Decoy fires, codenamed Starfish, were making life increasingly difficult for the Luftwaffe. So too was the MECOM, or masked beacon system, in which signals from German medium-frequency direction-finding beacons were picked up and re-radiated in sufficient strength to confuse the bomber's aircrew. The Blitz had reached an equilibrium in which the air defences remained unable to inflict heavy losses on the Luftwaffe, while the latter's medium bombers could not deliver the knockout blow to Britain's cities. The bombing campaign reached a climax in early May, with a heavy raid on London which started 2,000 fires and killed 1,500 people. But the Blitz had run its course. Hitler's armies were concentrating on the borders of the Soviet Union. The build-up for the invasion of Russia, codenamed Barbarossa, was almost complete. The great majority of the bombers so recently pounding London was soon to see action on the Eastern Front, once again supporting the advancing armies below them. Nearly 1,000 miles to the west, London was licking its wounds. Once again, the bombers had got through. They had inflicted grievous damage on London and Britain's great cities, but they had not destroyed the morale of the British or their war industries. Amid the wreckage, individual life and the life of the nation went on. The Royal Air Force, too, was learning the hard way. In December 1939, a daylight raid by 24 Wellingtons on the enemy's naval base at Wilhelmshaven had been mauled by Me-109s. To survive in the skies over Germany, the RAF's bombers would have to fly by night. But throughout 1940, the night bombers, navigating not by beams but by dead reckoning, could inflict no more than pinpricks on German war industry. And by 1941, Bomber Command had become the subject of a rancorous inter-service dispute. The Royal Navy was pressing hard for the use of Bomber Command's resources in the Battle of the Atlantic. Air power was one of the most important weapons in the struggle against the U-boat wolfpacks. The Navy argued that the RAF's bombers would be better employed against the U-boats and their bases, rather than mainland Europe. Britain's survival was at stake in the Atlantic, and the strategic bombing offensive was consuming a disproportionate share of available aircraft production and scientific resources. An Air Ministry report, delivered in August 1941, confirmed the inaccuracy of Bomber Command against targets in Germany. Flying against the Ruhr, only 1/10 of Bomber Command crews were placing their bombs within 5 miles of their aiming point. A Bomber Command navigator recalled,
"And so, results of all this dead reckoning navigation, failure of weather forecasting to give us accurate wind over a continent where there was no weather stations, and all these things meant that probabilities was that you would even bomb the wrong town."
German night fighter defenses were also improving with the introduction of long and short-range radars. This enabled night fighters to be scrambled in a nocturnal version of the Battle of Britain. Searchlights were concentrated around key targets. The architect of Germany's air defenses by night was General Josef Kammhuber. Behind his coastal radars, Kammhuber redeployed most of the German searchlight and gun defenses, and more radars, into a line stretching from Schleswig-Holstein to Belgium. Major cities, particularly those in the industrial Ruhr, were ringed by additional integrated searchlight and artillery defenses. The system became known as the Kammhuber Line. Next, Kammhuber moved the searchlight batteries, which had originally cooperated with his night fighters, back to the cities and built up a line of boxes, each of which was patrolled by a single night fighter under radar control. British bombers were now killing German civilians at about the same rate as the German defenses were killing expensively trained Bomber Command aircrew. The chances of a crew completing its tour of 30 missions was about 1 in 3. Morale was fraying at the edges. The problem was compounded by the continuing dispatch of bombers singly and at staggered intervals. This was supposed to prolong the agony of German civilians throughout the night, but it was achieved only at the cost of sacrificing the principle of concentration over the target. In desperation, the Chief of the Air Staff, Air Chief Marshal Sir Charles Portal, submitted to Winston Churchill a plan for the building of 4,000 bombers, a task which would have consumed the entire resources of the British war economy. Bombing alone, Portal argued, could win the war. Churchill rejected the offer. The war was to last nearly 3 years before Bomber Command was fully equipped with aircraft capable of fulfilling its mission to strike hard at the heart of Germany. The first of Bomber Command's 4-engined heavies was the Short Stirling, which entered service in 1941. The Stirlings were ungainly, but immensely rugged. One of them survived a head-on collision with a German night fighter. By the end of 1941, 150 Stirlings were flying with Bomber Command. The Stirling was followed into service by the Handley Page Halifax. The last of the heavies to enter service was the Avro Lancaster, the specifications for which had been issued in 1936. Now Bomber Command had the tools for the job. A typical medium bomber early in the war, the HE-111 for example, could carry a 4,000-pound bomb load with fuel for 1,200 miles. The first of the RAF heavies, the Short Stirling, could carry a payload 3 times bigger with fuel for 600 miles. In contrast, the Handley Page Halifax could carry a 13,000-pound load with fuel for nearly 2,000 miles. The Avro Lancaster could carry a payload of 14,000 pounds with fuel for nearly 1,700 miles. The arrival in numbers of the heavies coincided with a new directive. The main weight of Bomber Command's operations was to be thrown into area attacks on German cities rather than precision raids on German war industry. Henceforward, 75% of the total tonnage of British bombs were to fall on area targets. A scientific basis for the area bombing policy was provided in a paper presented to Churchill by Professor Lindemann. He drew a direct connection between war production and falling morale, induced by the bombing of built-up areas where the war workers lived. Lindemann calculated that on average 1 ton of bombs dropped on a built-up area would dehouse up to 200 war workers. With its new bombers, Bomber Command would be able to destroy the homes of 1/3 of the population of Germany. The new directive, issued in February 1942, coincided with the arrival at Bomber Command of a new chief, Air Marshal Sir Arthur Harris. Harris was not the author of the area bombing policy, but he was a man committed to it with every fibre of his being. Nicknamed Bomber, Harris was to be the tireless executor of the policy of area bombing. He said of the Germans,
"They sowed the wind, and now they are going to reap the whirlwind."
Harris's bombers were beginning to take delivery of the equipment which would guide them to their targets in Germany. Technology provided the key. The first navigational aid, codenamed G, had been introduced in the winter of 1941. A special receiver in the bomber picked up the trains of pulses beamed across Europe by 3 separate transmitters. In the bomber, the navigator measured the time difference between the pulses and with the aid of a grid chart calculated the aircraft's position. A year later, Bomber Command introduced a blind bombing system codenamed Oboe. A ground station, codenamed Cat, transmitted a beam along which the receiving aircraft flew. The second station, Mouse, told the bomber when to release its bomb. The Oboe stations could handle only 1 aircraft at a time on its bombing run. This task initially fell to the fast, high-flying Mosquito. Mosquito squadrons joined a new pathfinding formation, 8 Group, whose role was to find and illuminate the target with multicolored pyrotechnics known as target indicators, or TIs. By the summer of 1943, the marking and bombing was orchestrated by a single master bomber circling the target. Main force bombers were now equipped with H-2S, a downward-looking radar housed in a blister under the fuselage. Its echoes provided the navigator with a picture of the terrain over which the bomber was flying. To multiply their destructive power, the bombers now carried high-capacity bombs, which had the minimum of metal casing containing the maximum amount of high explosive. The gruff Air Marshal Harris possessed a flair for publicity matched only by General Montgomery, the victor of El Alamein. In May 1942, he launched his aircraft on a 1,000-bomber raid on the city of Cologne. Germany was about to reap the whirlwind. By the summer of 1942, Harris had a new ally. The US 8th Air Force arrived in England that August. At first, the formations of B-17s, heavily escorted by fighters, suffered few losses in a warm-up period confined to targets in France and the Low Countries. Confidence ran high, alongside a fierce belief that the bombers, flying in tight formation, would be able to fight their way to and from their targets without suffering heavy losses. It was a very American concept, like the cavalry in the Wild West, shooting its way in and out again. But things swiftly got tougher when the 8th Air Force's focus switched to targets in Germany which lay beyond the range of its P-47 Thunderbolt escorts. By March 1943, rising losses led to a greater concentration of defensive firepower in the stacked 54 aircraft combat wing composed of 3 18-aircraft groups. The formation was about 1¼ miles wide and half a mile deep, with some 600 yards between the leading and trail aircraft. Squeezed into the combat wing, the B-17s and Liberators could not bring all their heavy machine guns to bear and remained extremely vulnerable to head-on attacks against the high and low bombers in each 18-aircraft group. The sheer weight of defensive armament carried by the American bombers also presented 8th Air Force with another acute problem. The Lancaster, less heavily armed because it flew by night, carried a payload of 14,000 pounds with fuel for nearly 1,700 miles. In contrast, the Liberator and the B-17, originally designed as maritime patrol bombers, were limited to standard bomb loads of 4,000 pounds over ranges several hundred miles longer. As the battle warmed up over Germany, the Luftwaffe's day fighters adopted increasingly heavy cannon armament, and later ripple-fired rockets. In 1943, heavy losses reached a climax on the 17th of August, when 291 bombers flying twin raids against war plants in Schweinfurt and Regensburg lost 60 planes and suffered another 138 badly damaged. Average losses per mission were now running at nearly 10%. Bombing operations were temporarily suspended. 3 months earlier, Harris and his American counterpart, General Ira Eaker, had endorsed the point-blank directive, which ordered the progressive destruction and dislocation of the German military and economic system, and the undermining of the morale of the German people to a point where their capacity for armed resistance has been fatally weakened. Harris delivered the first blows in this campaign in what became known as the Battle of the Ruhr. It was to reach a climax in a series of devastating raids flown against the city of Hamburg at the end of July. By now, Bomber Command had a new weapon, showers of metal foil strips, codenamed Window, and designed to clutter German radars with false returns. Window worked well on the night of the 24th of July. The Kammhuber line was reduced to impotence as the bomber stream, concentrated now, was pushed through a small number of its fighter boxes. The line's defenses were plunged into darkness. Just under 800 aircraft, of which nearly half were Lancasters, flew in to create a raging firestorm in the heart of the city. On the night of the 26th, 730 aircraft of Bomber Command raised a second, bigger firestorm which claimed 40,000 lives. In all, Bomber Command flew 4 raids on Hamburg between the 24th of July and the 2nd of August. 8,500 tons of bombs had been dropped on Hamburg for the loss of 87 aircraft, an acceptable loss rate of just under 3%. The raids rang the death knell of the Kammhuber line, but also called into being more sophisticated German night fighter tactics, in which twin-engined aircraft were scrambled to orbit a beacon and then vectored onto the bomber streams from the ground. Below the fighters, radar operators learned how to distinguish between real bomber returns and those generated by Window. The night war over a blacked-out Germany was developing into an intense electronic battle as each side introduced new measures and countermeasures. Tinsel was the code name for microphones fitted to a bomber's engine nacelle to jam the nearest night fighter net with noise transmitted on the frequency it used. When night fighter equipment fell into British hands, the tables were turned. The Luftwaffe's night fighters became the prey of specially equipped British Beaufighter and Mosquito intruders. The intruders accompanied the bomber streams to home in on the transmissions from German night fighters as they circled their beacons.
Okay, I can see him. Keep going. Right, 1 o'clock 15, range about 500. Still overtaking very slowly. Okay, I'll hold him now. Have a look with the glasses. Right. It's a twin engine. I can't see any exhausts.
Okay, I've got the glasses. Where is he?
Coffin. It's 88. Definitely. Okay, that's what I thought it was. Well, this ought to shake him.
In the autumn of 1943, Harris was sufficiently confident to inform Churchill that we can wreck Berlin from end to end. It will cost us 500 bombers. It will cost Germany the war. But it very nearly cost Harris Bomber Command. Berlin was too big, too well defended, and too far away to be wrecked by the British heavies. The battle for air control moved into a higher gear. In the next 4 months, in worsening weather conditions, Bomber Command flew to Berlin 16 times. The maximum effort involved nearly 10,000 bomber sorties. The German air defenses were waiting for them. In the Battle of Berlin, which encompassed several other German cities, Bomber Command lost 600 bombers shot down or written off. And this in spite of a range of new methods. On the night of the 19th of February 1944, for example, 113 Pathfinders and 740 main force heavies flew against the Junkers factory at Leipzig. Diversionary raids had been flown by 50 mine-laying aircraft toward the Baltic, and Mosquitoes had been dispatched on a spoof raid on Berlin. But the German defenses refused to be drawn. Night fighters infiltrated the bomber stream and shot down 78 aircraft. The Battle of Berlin was called off after a disastrous raid on Nuremberg at the end of March 1944, in which nearly 100 aircraft were lost. Bomber Command were learning what 8th Air Force had discovered in the summer of 1943. You must first defeat the enemy air force before you can attack the enemy nation. The Luftwaffe and the German people remained unsubdued. After the Battle of Berlin, the American General Spaatz, commander of the newly formed US Strategic Air Forces in Europe, privately concluded that Harris was all washed up. In 1943, the Americans had passed through their own crisis. Their lack of a long-range escort fighter had enabled the Luftwaffe to choose the time and place to attack the bomber formations. Morale had plummeted. The Thunderbolt escort fighters had been fitted with 110-gallon drop tanks, but these had to be jettisoned the moment combat was joined. But 8th Air Force had the answer. The beginning of 1944 saw the introduction of the P-51D Mustang fighter, powered by the same Rolls-Royce Merlin engine used by the Lancaster and capable of escorting the bomber formations all the way to their targets in Germany. The Mustangs were not merely escorts. They formed fighting patrols whose role was to seek out and destroy the enemy. American bomber losses began to fall. Luftwaffe day fighter losses, and with them many irreplaceable pilots, began to rise. At the end of February 1944, in Big Week, the Americans also targeted German aircraft production. It had climbed steadily, thanks to a dispersal program initiated by Armaments Minister Albert Speer. Now it began to fall away. The Americans were beginning to get their fingers round the German jugular. The build-up to Operation Overlord, the Allied invasion of Normandy, was now overshadowing the strategic bombing offensive against Germany. Bomber Command and 8th Air Force had to be dragged kicking and screaming into the bombing of transport targets in the weeks leading up to D-Day. Harris remained wedded to the policy of area bombing, dismissing all other targets as mere panaceas. Like a general on the Western Front in 1916, he believed that one more big push would bring Germany to its knees.
And the man who looks back over his shoulder and thinks he's got a lead may have nasty surprises coming to him. Now is not the time in any way to ease up, but to put on what indeed may prove sooner perhaps than some of us think the final spurt.
But the Americans had found a fatal weakness in the German war economy, which was no mere panacea. In an offensive limited by the demands of Overlord, they attacked targets connected with enemy oil production. In March 1944, the Luftwaffe's supplies of aviation fuel dropped by 2/3. The Luftwaffe had the aircraft, but a dwindling supply of fuel to keep them flying. Lack of fuel also spelt the end of an efficient program to train new pilots to replace those cut down by the Mustangs. All that remained for the Luftwaffe was a series of increasingly desperate measures. A revolutionary new generation of jet interceptors would have savaged the American combat wings had they been introduced in 1943. But Hitler's fatal meddling with the jet and rocket fighter program ensured that they arrived too late and in insufficient numbers to turn the tide. The jets gave the American bomber formations a nasty shock, but weight of numbers was now beginning to tell. By 1945, Bomber Command was now flying by day as well as night. It had a daily availability of 1,600 aircraft. The rugged Halifax and the hard-hitting Lancaster. It had its own dedicated electronic warfare formation, 100 Group, to bamboozle the Luftwaffe's shredded air defenses. It was capable of launching spectacular raids against pinpoint targets, but remained in the grim business of area bombing. Rather late in the day, the Lancaster's rear turret was being fitted with a gun-laying radar. And yet in the last 4 months of the war, Bomber Command lost 608 aircraft, nearly twice its frontline strength in 1939. It is a measure of the scale of its operations that it could absorb these losses without pausing for breath. The climax of area bombing came with the raid on Dresden on the night of the 13th of February 1945. Each wave of bombers was concentrated over the target within the space of minutes. Controlled by a master bomber, they raised a firestorm which killed at least 50,000 people. Dresden was an area bombing operation par excellence, but a political disaster for Bomber Command. The city was virtually undefended and crammed with refugees. The raid had been ordered by Winston Churchill, who was eager to demonstrate British willingness to help Stalin as the Red Army drove into eastern Germany. Dresden did not figure on Harris's target list, but in the aftermath of the raid, both he and Bomber Command took the blame for the conclusion of a policy, area bombing, which had enjoyed Churchill's wholehearted support for over 3 years. Nevertheless, in the winter of 1944-45, American and British bombers had, above all, paralyzed the German transport system, which in turn had paralyzed German economic life. But in spite of terrible losses, 600,000 dead, 10 times the number killed in the Blitz, the morale of German civilians did not crack. It had not in London in 1940, nor did it in Hamburg or Berlin. Within 5 months of the Hamburg raids, the city's war production had climbed back to 80% of its previous capacity. Victory in the skies over Germany had been bought at a high price. In 1944 alone, the Americans had lost nearly 2,500 bombers. By the end of the war, Bomber Command had lost nearly 55,000 dead, more than the number of British Army officers killed in the First World War. Victory had been secured by the remorseless technological pressure the Allies were able to bring to bear on the enemy, by the secret electronic war in which Bomber Command won the vital last round, and in the air superiority triumph clinched by the Mustang. Without the black boxes and the escort fighters, the Allied combined bomber offensive could not have been sustained. They enabled the bombers to hasten the collapse of Germany and the end of the war. In the final analysis, the bomber had got through.